Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our ARP Fiscal Recovery Fund, navigating the reporting requirements and uniform guidance. I'm Erin Hurley. I serve as the Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of Counties, and I am joined by
Emily Brock. I'm the Director of GFOA's Federal Liaison Center. Happy to be here today.
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining. So as I mentioned, we're going to be going through the reporting requirements, of course, with the upcoming deadline for the Project and Expenditure Report, and then do a deep dive into the uniform guidance as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, great. So this is just an outline of what we are going to be going over today. So in terms of reporting and compliance deadlines, we'll do an overview of the Project and Expenditures Report, what the actual structure is of the report itself when you're actually in Treasury's portal. We'll also discuss key concepts, key considerations for the report. We'll talk about the revenue loss replacement and electing for the standard allowance or electing to continue with the Treasury revenue loss formula. And then, as I mentioned, talking about the uniform guidance and the recovery fund. So what is uniform guidance? How does it apply to the recovery fund? And of course, why do you have to pay attention to the uniform guidance? And then we won't go over the helpful resources too much, but we are sharing these slides after both NACo and GFOA is going to be sharing these slides. So you'll have those resources for you. And then, of course, before we jump into the webinar as well, I do want to mention that we are recording this webinar, which will be available both for NACo members and GFOA members as well. So to kick off the presentation, we, of course, wanted to provide an overview of the reporting deadlines. So, and the frequency in which recipients will submit those deadlines. So for the quarterly project and expenditure reports, so those are due at the end of this month. For those of you that are submitting quarterly reports, this will be your first time submitting a project and expenditures report, and you are, within a specific tier. You have less than 250,000 residents and received less than $10 million in recovery funds. For the annual project and expenditures reports, this is actually going to be your first report that you are submitting. Those are you reside within a jurisdiction that has a population below 250,000 residents and received less than $10 million. So, if you submitted a quarterly report, you're above 250,000 residents and receive more than $10 million. And then also the recovery plan performance reports, those only also apply to recipients that have populations of 250,000 residents or above as well, and you submit those on an annual basis. And on this slide, simply here, what I just mentioned, again, this is on Treasury's website, but it just outlines exactly the quarterly and annual reporting requirements that as well as the recovery plan performance report. So it's a really helpful graph. This is within Treasury's compliance and reporting guidance that is all on their website. Very, very helpful resource that outlines what is required for the project and expenditure report, as well as the recovery plan performance report. So when we're talking about the project and expenditure report, what are some of the key concepts? So first is the expenditure categories. You may remember that Treasury provided an update to their compliance and reporting requirements just a couple months ago. So now there are actually 83 different expenditure categories to choose from, which of course, as you are filling out your project overview, you have to align your project with an eligible category. For those projects that you will be reporting on, these can be either new or existing, and they are funded in whole or in part with those recovery funds. And as I mentioned, they do have to align with one expenditure category as well. And as you are standing up these new projects, you're required to track obligations and expenditures, as well as subrecipients and subawards as well too. And then finally, the last key concept of the project and expenditure report is really around what's the relationship between these, smaller project components. So each one is related to one another. And you'll see as we kind of go through, we show some graphs of what the project and expenditure portal actually looks like. But you have to make sure when you are submitting a project that you align it with the subrecipient, a beneficiary, and the contractor information as well too. So it's all interrelated. The same goes for the subaward or direct payments, and then also the expenditures as well.
And so, as Erin said, there's a great amount of resources on the Treasury's website, but we are empathetic with our members' discussions about there is so much information, it's hard to navigate. It's hard to understand where and how you put information in different categories. For example, recently we've had, we've explored Treasury's YouTube site where we found some helpful tutorials that were a bit of a surprise to us, and we're trying our very best to make sure that people know where the resources are. But just FYI, your project and expenditure report, the information that's required on your project and expenditure report is almost exclusively in the compliance and reporting guidance. So really, drilling into Treasury and drilling into the compliance and reporting guidance, that is a very useful resource about what everything looks like, how you might be prepared from an internal controls perspective to be able to be ready for April 30th, but also like what kind of information are they going to ask for? And here's the kinds of information that they're going to ask for. First of all, making sure you understand the project. Once you get into the project, make sure that you understand that it's going to be asking you information about yourself and what the project looks like, the description of the project. What is the project? Where is it? How does it align with the expenditure category that you've chosen? Then you're going to start to define your subrecipients / subawards. Now, there are plenty of people on this call who I know certainly got hung up in the January 30th iteration of the portal. And that was because there was this sort of conflation of topics, calling all kinds of subcontractors, awards, grants, loans, they just kind of called them subrecipients, which is a big red flag in the uniform guidance world. And so what we did is we worked with Treasury to help it be more intuitive for the inputting of information. So now there is a separation of the concepts between subrecipients, beneficiaries, and contractors. And then in addition, these subawards and direct payments that you're making to individuals. So that certainly was something that was a big challenge for a lot of folks in January 30th. And luckily now we have a little bit more explanation, a little bit more guidance on how to approach the inputting of that type of information. Then you get to the easy part, the expenditures. Expenditures, though, have to equal what you said that you spent. So make sure from an internal controls perspective that as you're reporting on projects, that your expenditures in your Excel spreadsheets or whatever it is that you're doing to organize the information to input into the portal has been checked, cross-checked, and the information is identical, because it's very hard to submit a report that has errors in it. And of course, fact-checking and making sure that you have that information correct is sometimes a hassle to go back. And then last, recipient-specific information, whether in an aggregate or a singular format. One other thing I did want to mention is that if you do have payments greater than $50,000, we've certainly been working with our friends at the National Institute of Government Purchasing. NIGP members have started to suggest that if you do have a contract or are establishing a subrecipient relationship with a payment greater than $50,000, it certainly benefits you to actually request that vendor register at sam.gov. If they have a sam.gov registration, it certainly makes that number 4 part easier in submitting information in your project and expenditure report. So just a quick FYI and an easy thing to do on the front end, just to make sure that April 30th date is a little bit easier. On the next slide, it's a really good snapshot of how you might approach the project and expenditure report. Remember, you're going to select one expenditure category for all of the related expenditures. Now, in this chart, for example, they use the word EC 1.1 COVID-19 vaccination. Now, of course, you may probably have some salaries associated with that, some overhead associated with that, some other expenditures that aren't specifically COVID-19 vaccination. What Treasury recommends that you do from an internal controls perspective is funnel all of the expenditures related to that project into that single EC. So just make sure that you're focusing on that, grabbing all those expenditures and putting it where it needs to go. Then you go into that project category. You are entering into the project category in the portal, and it's going to ask you the project details, which includes subrecipients, if any, the subaward, and the expenditures on the portal. Now on the next slide, this is a few things that Erin and I have picked up from conversations with our members about what are some of the big FAQs and what are the things that you should be looking out for as you're approaching your project and expenditure report. Now, probably one of the most frequently asked questions, other than what is uniform guidance, the second most frequently asked question from our members, among our members, is, I don't have any projects to report. My county council just came together and we just made the decision. We haven't had, we haven't established a budget that would allow for the funds to flow that would allow for expenditures and obligations to be made. You're not alone. That certainly is something that a lot of jurisdictions across the country are experiencing, and Treasury heard that. And they made it so that you can approach the project and expenditure report on April 30th with no projects. Remember, even if you do have a planned project, but you haven't made a single obligation or expenditure, you don't have to report obligations and expenditures that haven't been made, right? So you can plan, you can have had a public conversation, you can have some ideas on how you want to spend the money, but until you have an obligation or an expenditure on a planned expenditure, you don't have to report anything in the portal. You can say, as an option, I don't have any projects established. I don't have any obligations or expenditures in my projects. And in that case, Treasury has said, you can tell us that. We'll take that information, but we also want a written explanation from you. Written justification. I like their new acronym, the WJ. It kind of sounds like a cool new network. So the WJ is required if you don't have obligations or expenditures on any planned project. So make sure that you're prepared for that and with that information. There is programmatic data, significant programmatic data that is required in certain expenditure categories, especially in education, in health, lots of evidence-based criteria that's a requirement for spending in certain expenditure categories. Make sure to seek those out in the compliance and reporting guidance. One of the most important bits of information and amounts of information that you'll need to pull together is regarding any infrastructure. Now, remember, this is infrastructure spending in category 5. So in EC5, which is water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, they note in the compliance and reporting guidance that if the total spend of the project is over $10 million, all of the information required for that infrastructure project has to be entered manually. And you can find that information in Appendix D of the Project and Expenditure Report User Guide. Also in this information in the compliance and reporting guidance, there's more information about the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, I'm a Virginian and I love my state, and we are not a Davis-Bacon state. And so I've heard a lot of anecdotes from my neighbors, my communities in my state, that this is a major, major consideration for our selection of spending on infrastructure, because there is significant amounts of information that's required for your project and expenditure guidance or project and expenditure report. So pay attention to that. If you do find a project that is going into EC5, there is significant amounts of information that you'll have to aggregate ahead of time and get ready for the portal.
Great. Well, in addition to some of those FAQs that Emily just went over, another huge one that we are receiving is around revenue replacement. And how do you fill out that section of your project and expenditure report? Are you required to make the decision? In short, yes. You are required to make the one-time decision in this April report of whether you are choosing the $10 million revenue loss standard allowance, or you are going to use the Treasury revenue loss formula that has been updated in the final rule. There are no exceptions, there are no extensions. This is a requirement. It is very clearly outlined in the updated compliance and reporting requirements document that Treasury has released. So now kind of breaking down into what this means. So many of you filled out your interim report. For the larger entities, you filled out your project and expenditure report at the end of January. So whatever information that you had provided either in your interim report or your project and expenditures report, that information will be automatically included in the fields in the revenue replacement field. So you have the option, of course, to update that information now. Again, choosing the $10 million standard allowance. Of course, that doesn't exceed your actual award allocation if you receive less than 10 million, or use the revenue loss formula as well. I do want to stress that whatever option that you do end up going with, you have to stick with that option for the entire duration of the program's life. So of course, until December 31st of 2026, when the program ends. So we've just been receiving a lot of questions. If this is required, if there's any way that you can defer, and the answer is no, you are required to make this decision on this report. I also do want to mention as well too, and maybe we can post the link in the chat later as well. There is a calculator that GFOA had created. It's on NACo's website, on GFOA's website, that they had, and Emily, you can speak more to this, but they have created a downloadable Excel sheet that has the formula actually embedded in that sheet. You can fill out each one of your revenue streams. It has the updated revenue loss default growth rate that Treasury included in their new final rule, which is a 5.2%. It's a difference from the previous 4.1% under the interim final rule. So that is a very helpful tool as you are deciding whether you want to claim the standard allowance or go with the revenue loss formula. And Emily, definitely feel free to jump in about the calculator or anything else.
Oh, for sure. So we're very, very happy to share that publicly with anyone who asks whom. A lot of people, I know a lot of counties I'm noticing are kind of stuck on that threshold of the $10 million. So if I calculate this lost revenue, now that they've made the final rule a little bit more luxurious, you can add in, for example, utility revenues. That's going to make my lost revenue actually higher than the $10 million threshold. Counties are kind of on that line, I'm finding. And so you might want to just go ahead and give the calculator a try. Add in all the information that you can. It may put you above that $10 million threshold, of course, which puts a little bit more of your ARPA funding into the government services category, which is a little bit easier. So thanks, Erin, for plugging that. And we do have it on both of our websites. All right, so now let's go to the belle of the ball, the uniform guidance. So I say the belle of the ball simply because uniform guidance has become front and center, and certainly not necessarily something that is well known across all of the practice areas in local governments. And the reason for that is because uniform guidance really is only applicable, well, it applies to folks who have had sort of sequenced federal funding. So it may be that we have lots of folks on this webinar who are very well versed in uniform guidance, but we also might have folks on this line who don't really have a firm understanding of uniform guidance. So we really are going to start from square one to talk about uniform guidance, then apply it to SDRRF so that you have a basic understanding of, yes, I understand these federal procurement guidelines, this is how it applies here. And then why do you have to pay attention, and providing you lots of resources that you can then yourself apply your individual circumstances to questions about uniform guidance. Okay, so starting it off, uniform guidance. Uniform guidance is, in the Wizard of Oz, there was the horse of many colors. This is sort of ubiquitous. It's called a lot of things, first of all. In the Federal Register, it's called Uniform Grant Guidance, or UGG, as you might hear from your auditors. We often shorten it up to UG, or Uniform Guidance. But really the place where it sits is in 2 CFR 200, which CFR is an acronym for the Code of Federal Regulations. And so 2 CFR 200 is the major chapter in which uniform guidance sits. When you dive in, you can actually Google 2 CFR 200 and you can read the different parts of the Code of Federal Regulations that apply to SLFRF, and we'll sprinkle those in this presentation as well. But generally what it is it's a tool for the federal government to communicate universal standards to recipients of federal funds. It's a framework for grants management that reduces administrative burden for you guys, for us local governments who are receiving the federal awards, while at the same time allowing for the federal government to reduce the risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. And so if you kind of read into that waste, fraud, and abuse, you get the sense of where we're going here, and we are heading into sort of the audit category. So it gives you tools on how you can spend the federal money, and then it also gives the auditors a framework to base the purchases and how they're made with federal money. So really a guideline, a framework that's useful for you as you're approaching your spending, and useful and fundamentally useful to the auditors who will look back and watch your funding and report and offer opinions on the approach that you took to spend your funding. So on the next slide, really kind of when we talk about it, there are principles that are inside, again, of 2 CFR 200. And there's 4 major categories. First of all, there's major sort of principled spending on administrative requirements for grants and cooperative agreements. So simply, sort of put that simply, it allows for the spender of the federal grants to have a good understanding of how do I administer this? How do I legally administer this? How do I make sure that my procurement is in the framework of what you need? If I have salaries or if I have other types of spending that I'm trying to do, not just procurement of things, but procurement of services, where is it that I go and what are those administrative requirements on approach? Second, there are cost principles for determining allowable costs. That's kind of a juicy issue, a juicy part of uniform guidance. Those cost principles allow for us to sort of break down inside of the spend, inside of how you are buying your materials. What are the cost principles that then I can use in order to use this structured framework, use this legal framework to make those purchases? The cost principles generally is dominated by one key concept, which is open and fair competitive grants processes, competitive acquisition, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Third, uniform guidance articulates the audit requirements. So as I mentioned, here's sort of the ultimate sort of pinnacle of uniform guidance. Those audit requirements then allow for your auditor to watch your spending, look at how you're spending, and then offer opinion on how you're spending. And then last, there's agency implementation. And what I think is important is agency implementation is important because you may have different cost principles, different administrative requirements in FEMA spending, for example, than you would have in SLFRF. So there is some differentiation in uniform guidance between the different agencies. And typically the way that they make that differentiation is by putting out what's called a compliance supplement or an addendum to compliance supplements. Those compliance supplements of 2 CFR 200 allow for us to look at uniform guidance, see how it applies to SLFRF, and very specifically, if there are any deviations from the written word of 2 CFR 200, those deviations are articulated in what are called compliance supplements. And there's been one significant deviation that Aaron will go into later on in this presentation on SLFRF audit requirements in particular. Now, let's go into really quickly a couple 2 CFR 200s and pinpoint the places where you might find the most useful information for your procurement, your audit, your spend. So first of all, purchasing and procurement in uniform guidance. You can find this in 2 CFR 200.319. And you can also see this repeated verbatim in the compliance and reporting guidance from US Treasury. What Treasury is saying is that property or services in all circumstances must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition, which means those standards that are outlined in uniform guidance, 2 CFR 200-320, which allows for non-competitive procurements only in limited circumstances. And I'd like to also really highlight that. These circumstances which allow for your purchasing and procurement to be non-competitive are very limited. And if you do think that you qualify for a non-competitive procurement, definitely talk with your auditor. Give a call to your auditor, try to get their thoughts on this, on whether or not it qualifies for a non-competitive procurement. So, couple of limited circumstances. First of all, the item is below the micro purchase threshold. The micro purchase threshold in SDRRF is 50,000, but you may have more stringent requirements in your state. I found that several states across the country have more stringent requirements on the micro purchase threshold. So you're covered in that category. You would be covered in that category in the micro purchase threshold category. Second, the item is only available from a single source. Think about intellectual property for vaccines or something like that, where it's very, very limited single source. That I think is unique to the fact that those are very, very limited circumstances for that non-competitive procurement. Third, the public exigency or emergency doesn't permit a delay from publicizing a competitive solicitation. That is, you don't even have enough time to execute an RFP or an RFQ. And some have argued actually to the Treasury that this public emergency, this pandemic, didn't give me enough time to publicize a competitive solicitation. Now, Treasury, of course, has not issued a waiver from uniform guidance that I'm aware of. So it's especially important to understand that that would be extremely rare, and it isn't necessarily a pandemic that would qualify you for that non-competitive waiver. And last, after a solicitation of a number of services, competition then is determined inadequate. So that's an assessment, again, that requires you to go through the RFP, RFQ process. And then after going through that, the competition is determined inadequate. So again, very limited circumstances for non-competitive waivers, but still, nevertheless, wanted to make sure that you're aware. Of course, that's in uniform guidance, and it's reiterated verbatim in compliance and reporting guidance. Now, on the next slide, we'd also like to go into the concept of subawards and subrecipients, because we mentioned that in the portal, this became a big thing on January 30th, where the definition of subawards and subrecipients kind of jammed together in the portal. And a lot of folks said, I don't have an established subrecipient relationship if I just purchased an ambulance outright with cash. I simply have a subaward that I made. Now, 2 CFR 200 is very good at helping to establish the bright line between what is a subaward and what is a subrecipient. So, but again, that is facts and circumstances around that particular engagement or relationship from the spender of the funds to the vendor. And certainly a conversation, again, that you should have with your auditor about determination of whether it's a subaward or a subrecipient. But the most important thing about uniform guidance when it comes to subawards and subrecipients is that if you do have a subrecipient relationship that's been established, it's both repeated in uniform guidance as well as in Treasury, that it's your responsibility to monitor compliance, monitor their compliance. Because once you establish that relationship between the subrecipient and the prime recipient, then the reporting of the spending of the information becomes the responsibility of the prime recipient. So creating internal controls, which may be policies and procedures that then would allow for you to monitor the spending of your subrecipients, is something that is not only encouraged by uniform guidance, in many cases it's required that you manage and monitor those subrecipient relationships. And I think I'm turning it over to you, Erin, yes?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Emily. So now let's talk about the uniform guidance in practice and the single audit. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later. Emily mentioned the alternative now, but because of the uniform guidance, of course, recipients are also required to implement certain practices. So in terms of internal controls, what does that mean? So this is 2 CFR Part 200.303. So your organization, ultimately what you have to do, and again, this is outlined all in Treasury's compliance and reporting requirements document, but you have to develop and implement effective internal controls, ultimately to ensure that the funding and any sort of decisions you are making with recovery funds are an eligible use of funds and document any sort of determination. So what that means is, of course, it's not only you as a prime recipient, but it's your subrecipients. You have to monitor monitor how they are actually spending those dollars, and ultimately you are on the hook for those funds. So just making sure that you are implementing very strong internal controls. And then in terms of the single audit, so any non-federal entities that spend more than $750,000 or more a year in federal awards, you have to have an audit conducted in compliance with the uniform guidance. So that's the Single Audit Act right there. So as Emily has mentioned a number of times, what's so critical about this is that you need to talk to your auditor early about the reporting requirements, how you should actually report the expenditures you're making with recovery funds. So just, this is a huge one that obviously impacts many prime recipients under the ARPA Treasury's final rule. So this is one to absolutely pay attention to. And again, we'll talk about the alternative in just a moment here. And then Emily, I'm turning it back over to you.
Yes, so I'm going to go into the most frequently asked question that Erin and I have heard since SDRRF started. Does uniform guidance, does that fair and open competition clause apply if I'm just spending in government services? So that's the 6.1 question. That's the $1 million question. Most counties, of course, are probably thinking about utilizing that $10 million standard distribution. And if so, you might be considering taking that $10 million and putting it into your general fund to spend it, because, you know, that makes sense. Of course, you can spend it on government services that are not debt service, reserves, or pension fund contributions. So therefore, counties are deciding to actually plop it into their general fund, but you have to remember that those uniform guidance principles still govern the spending of that money that's being spent out of within uniform guidance out of your general fund. We have not received any indication from Treasury yet that there will be a relaxation of those rules. We don't anticipate them, because I think anticipating stuff from Treasury sometimes takes time that we don't really have between now and April 30th. And so all signs point to, when you do recover funds from SDRRF and you are deciding to use them on government services, that in principle, your uniform guidance actually applies. 2 CFR 200 applies to the spending of government services. Now, do I turn it back over to you, Erin?
You go ahead, Emily.
I went ahead and I think I did this. So yes, indeed, I kind of covered this slide early. I think we were trying to really state a point here, simply because, again, we get this question a lot, and we do actually hear from state members who have kind of said, well, you know, is there going to be a relaxation of the rules? Is there, you know, should we anticipate this? It's very hard for us to predict what Treasury is going to do. And we also cannot be, of course, accurate unless we say what we know, which is that uniform guidance principles indeed do apply in government services. So the last thing I want to say is, again, if you're using the funds as government services, and simply what that means is you are spending them maybe out of general fund, and maybe there's spending that's occurring in different areas of your county. So let's say, for example, You are planning to spend SLFRF funds on playground equipment. And you have given the responsibility of purchasing that playground equipment to your Parks and Rec department. Well, when the Parks and Rec department is ready to make that purchase, it would be important, of course, that the Parks and Rec department understands the uniform guidance principles that govern the spending of those funds. So what we've noticed in a lot of counties across the country is many finance offices are creating a checklist of uniform guidance principles that they then can distribute across the organization that allows for anyone who's making spending of the SLFRF funds out of general fund or for specific purposes, that they are doing so in compliance with uniform guidance. Now, the checklists, I've seen some have been very sophisticated and large and very long, and I've seen some that are very short, like, hey, come and talk with us because we want to make sure that everyone has used a universal understanding of this. But that checklist concept, you can find a couple of examples on GFOA's website on how to make sure the checklist can apply to your organization. So that is, okay, I see a lot of questions coming in and they're all awesome questions. And we will save some time to answer at the end. But yes, the checklist, we do have several examples on GFOA's website. And of course, very happy to share them with Erin so that we can have universal understanding of that. So next slide, we're getting to the meaty part. How does uniform guidance apply to SLFRF? And this is a substantial part of the compliance and reporting guidance as well. How do you know uniform guidance is applying to SLFRF? What Treasury has done for us is they've said, here's uniform guidance, here's SLFRF. First of all, allowable activities. When you're making decisions about how you can spend the money, make sure that you implement effective internal controls. Like Erin mentioned, if you have expenditures, you need to make sure those expenditures roll up into one expenditure category, one EC. That's one simple way that you can have internal controls that verifies the administrative requirement of uniform guidance. Because if all of those costs are going into an EC, you are satisfying the uniform guidance principle of making sure you have administrative protocol around the spending of the fund. Second, cost principles, some things that are unique to SLFRF beyond 2 CFR 200. First of all, implement internal controls and effective monitoring, especially of your subrecipients. If you have non-federal cost share that you're planning on using the funds on, the compliance and reporting guidance goes into how you make that determination of eligibility. Also, and I saw this chatter happen in the Q&A, questions about audit costs and consultant costs. Audit costs are eligible, consultant costs are eligible, and in the compliance and reporting guidance, they tell you exactly where to put those costs. So again, uniform guidance principles remain. Fourth, and this is a little heady maybe for the finance folks on the call, Treasury has established they are not going to be the cognizant agency for SLFRF. And the reason for that is because then they'd be the cognizant agency for everyone, because everyone has gotten SLFRF funds. So what they've said is if you have a NCRA from another federal agency, you can use that or choose to do the de minimis rate of 10%. So also in the cost principles. And last, they talk about how salaries and expenses were covered. Another principle, EUG principle that applies is your cash management principle. This came up very, very early in on the process where folks were saying, oh my gosh, I'm receiving money, I'm not spending it right away. Can I invest these proceeds? Can I invest this money? And what Treasury has said through uniform guidance principles, the funds are not subject to CMIA. That's the federal guideline for cash management. And what that means is that indeed, recipients of SLFRF can invest the funds and the invested proceeds, that is, if you have earnings from your investments, they don't necessarily have to be targeted toward SLFRF spending. So big major categories in uniform guidance is covered in your compliance and reporting guidance. On the next slide, a few more cost principles. making policies and procedures to determine eligibility is a big check mark in uniform guidance. Making sure your equipment and property management is tracked. So some of you on the line may be deciding to purchase assets, physical asset structures. In uniform guidance, there are principles on how the purchase has to be used, how it has to be maintained. And if you defease the asset, if you get rid of, sell the asset, there are instructions on how to get rid of the asset or to sell the asset. But otherwise, in uniform guidance, any purchase has to be used for the originally authorized purpose. Cost principles also go over the period of performance, which we probably know this in our sleep. I know certainly Erin and I do. Starts on March 3rd, 2021, ends on December 31st, 2024, or funds can be encumbered until 2026. And also for those of you, and I know there are several counties who have been doing loan programs where you may have program income. And of course, Erin and I have talked a lot about this as well. Calculate, document, and record. How are you making those loans? Where is the income going? How are you monitoring that income? And recordation is very, very important cost principle in SLFRF. And reporting. Wanted to, of course, the number one thing and the reason we're all here on April 30th, make sure you have controls so that you are ready to timely submit and you don't have any late submissions ahead of the time. So those are the SLFRF cost principles. I still have two more that I'm going to do. So let's dive into procurement and purchasing requirements. We mentioned this, of course, in uniform guidance generally, but specifically in SLFRF, like I said, they just really cut and pasted from uniform guidance. They went in and said, all right, that's what purchasing and procurement says in UG. This is what we say in SLFRF, full and open competition. That are the standards outlined in 2 CFR 200.320. Remember, if you are conducting procurement in the acquisition of physical assets, that is maybe some infrastructure assets, there is a competitive bidding and contractor oversight principles that have to apply. And with those are of course outlined in 2 CFR 200.320 as well. And you've got to make sure that you have internal controls on how to monitor the maintenance of those written standards of contracts and prohibitions on dealing with suspended or debarred parties. So good internal controls and suggestions on how to ensure the purchase is within the guidelines of uniform guidance. And last but not least, that subrecipient monitoring. This is a very, very important concept for SLFRF. Treasury has made that very clear, that they understand a lot of counties right now are working with, say, 501c3s or sister organizations that are helping them to conduct the purpose of the award. That's the key point. It becomes a subrecipient relationship when you subaward the money in order for that contractor or that 501c3 or that other organization to carry out the award on behalf of the recipient. So that once that subrecipient relationship has been established, it's especially important that that subrecipient monitoring then becomes written down. Like what a good thing that you might want to do is just go ahead and say, okay, I've established these 4 subrecipients. Here's how I'm going to be monitoring their spending. And an even more important thing that you need to do is you need to monitor, you need to make sure you have documentation with the risk that they will be in non-compliance. So ensure that you are mitigating that risk by making policies and procedures for you to monitor those subrecipient relationships is an especially important part of how you're going to be reporting for the P&E subsequently over quarters or over annually, that relationship and the spending that that partner is doing. One more. So, and also, like I mentioned, that subaward, we've actually talked about this just a few slides ago, the subaward subrecipient relationship. When you get into the portal, you are going to want to make sure that you understand where that threshold is, that $50,000 threshold. The $50,000 threshold is the key indicator of whether you will be reporting that relationship on an individual basis or you'll be aggregating the spending and submitting it in an Excel file. So if you have purchases or spend that happens at $49,999 and you've done it 3 dozen times, all the Treasury wants from you is an aggregate list in Excel spreadsheet, and you can just input that information, easy peasy. Of course, a little bit more information is required. Beneficiary information and other information is required. But once you get above that $50,000 threshold, Treasury is going to want a lot more information, and almost exclusively that information can be found on a vendor's registration at sam.gov. Which is why when we talk with our purchasing partners, we think to ourselves, okay, that $50,000 threshold is the point at which, if I'm going to establish a procurement relationship with them, that I'm going to go ahead and require a sam.gov registration. That certainly isn't universal. You don't see that very frequently, but this program might start a lot more vendors to actually register in sam.gov because it makes your reporting and compliance on the P&E report a lot easier.
All right, so now other subawards. So we're kind of backtracking to the single audit. So all of the information on this screen we have kind of gone over, but just to reiterate, again, any non-federal entity that spends more than $750,000 a year in federal awards have to have an audit conducted, again, in compliance with uniform guidance. So stressing the need to talk to your auditor early, how to report your expenditures. But now, most recently, there has been an alternative to the single audit that was announced. It's in the Federal Register now, so it is out there. So what is this alternative? Specifically, it applies to certain prime recipients. So specifically, it's direct recipients that received less than $10 million in recovery funds, as well as the recipients only of federal awards and the recipient spent less than $750,000. So first and foremost, these are kind of the top 11 things that you need to know if you think that you are eligible for this alternative. So first and foremost, speak with your auditor. Again, this is a very new alternative that was announced last week. So your auditor might not even know about this. And what is this alternative? So it's an addendum to the 2021 Single Audit Compliance Supplement. And what the title of it actually is Addendum 3. And so what it includes is a more simplified process to the single audit. It's referred to as an attestation for those direct recipients. Ultimately, the reason behind why this alternative was, provided is that it's intended to reduce administrative burden for recipients. I believe Emily knows the exact number, but it ultimately ends up impacting, I think, around 10,000 entities. So again, it's a big change, and it's very, very beneficial to those recipients that are eligible. So in terms of how does it apply? So the alternative applies to fiscal year audits that begin January 30th of 2020. And then ultimately what it actually results in is it results in an auditor's opinion on compliance, which includes an assessment of 2 activities, specifically activities allowed and unallowed or allowable costs. And this alternative is completely optional. You have a choice. You're not required to, comply with the alternative or opt into the alternative. So again, just reiterating, it is optional. And then in terms of eligibility, so the attestation eligibility would apply to direct recipients, either from Treasury or from states. So this applies specifically to non-entitlement units receiving under $10 million in total ARP recovery funds. And then the attestation eligibility would apply to direct recipients only if other federal awards the recipient expended are less than $750,000 during the recipient's fiscal year, not including the recovery funds that were obviously authorized under the American Rescue Plan. So what does that mean? That you could spend up to $749,000 in other federal spending Emily has used the example of Head Start. So as long as you don't pass that threshold, then you can use this alternative. So again, very, very significant. However, the single audit would still apply to recipients that spend over, of course, that $750,000 threshold in any other federal funds. So again, going back, if you spend above $750,000 in Head Start funds, then you would be subject to the single audit. The uniform guidance, it still applies to all funds, whether your county is eligible and you perform an attestation instead of the single audit as well too. So that's the alternative kind of in a nutshell. Again, those top 11 items that you really need to consider if you are eligible. So again, a very considerable change, very, very beneficial to smaller jurisdictions as you are going through the reporting process. And Emily, definitely jump in if I missed anything.
No, you got it all. I think this is the very welcome announcement for a lot of smaller jurisdictions out there. By smaller, simply, I mean just like fewer resources to get that single audit done. Single audit is comprehensive. Single audit requires financial recordation. Single audit requires a lot of stuff that this attestation relieves. So really, we are indebted to the AICPA for working on this so hard, simply because it allowed for a little bit of relaxation of those things. So if you are one of those eligible entities, as Erin said a couple of times, talk to your auditor. Of course, we love talking with you, but your auditor is the right person to ask about eligibility and what the next steps might be. And I guess I'd finally say the auditor is probably still learning about this as well. So we're all learning about it at the same time. They might not be 100% good to go on that, but certainly a good early conversation. And so last but not least, actually before we send the resources your way, why in the world do I have to pay attention to uniform guidance? And we are just so thankful that there are 750, 800 people on this call who are interested in knowing about this and learning about this. And we would ask too, that when we send out the recording of this, that you dispatch this far and wide. Our goal here is to make sure that all recipients of SLFRF funds understand what the guidelines are around uniform guidance on spending. The process of grants generally, I call it the 3 Bs: budgeting, buying, and broadcasting. So many of you are at the budgeting process where you're kind of thinking, all right, this is how and where I think I can spend. That is governed by uniform guidance. The way that you're figuring out the eligibility and making determinations on how to spend, that should be monitored. You should be writing that stuff down. It should be going through a process of making sure those eligibility requirements are met and documenting it. So that budgeting section is uniform guidance. Certainly the buying part is uniform guidance. Buying is whether you procure things, goods, or services. It certainly is covered in 2 CFR 200. So a good search or a good conversation with your auditor about that buying process as well is certainly an important thing to do. One of the more important things is, as many counties on this call I'm sure are, we don't necessarily all have a procurement officer in-house. we don't have people who are licensed and credentialed in procurement and purchasing. We're doing it ourselves. And so knowing and understanding just sort of generally what the uniform guidance principles are covers a lot of ground and helps for you to spend it in a way that, of course, helps you to minimize risk in the future. And then broadcasting, of course, the last B, you are about to submit your first Project and Expenditure Report. You're about to broadcast to the United States Treasury, and it's very likely United States Treasury will broadcast it to Congress, and Congress will broadcast it back to you. You know better than we do about the headline risk, the audit risk, all of the other things about broadcasting this information out to the World Wide Web and everywhere else. And so as long as you have a basic understanding of those uniform guidance principles that govern the spending, then, you know, this is an excellent first start. And if you are confused about certain areas of uniform guidance and how that might apply to your specific circumstance, Erin and I, again, would love to just repeat, call your auditor early. What is it? Vote early and vote often. Call your auditor early and call your auditor often, because that then allows for you, again, to maintain that relationship, make sure that there is the spending that you're doing is within the guidelines, and you're doing effective policies and procedures to ensure and minimize audit risk. Now, why has Treasury decided to use uniform guidance principles? Well, frankly, it's easy. Uniform is uniform, and the federal government loves uniform stuff. And because of that, then we are kind of subject to being a part of this uniform guidance framework, even if we've never been subject to it before. We're all learning together. We're all creating forums for us to better understand it together. And we're certainly happy that you're here and listening to this. And again, just I think a nice opportunity for us to share and make sure that we can all, together as a community, spend these dollars in a way that's effective and helps to minimize the risk to your entity moving forward.
Great, and these are just a list of some helpful resources for everyone. Again, when we do send out the slides, they're all hyperlinked. So as you can see on the screen, Treasury's compliance and reporting guidance, their project and expenditure report user guideline, which is very helpful, has screenshots of every part of the portal, single audit compliance supplement, the addendum 3, so that alternative to single audit. And then there are a number of actual videos that Treasury has released. They are on their YouTube channel, but so for these videos, each of these are step-by-step walkthrough videos of going through the portal. How do you actually submit your project and expenditure report? If your county or city is only claiming the revenue loss standard allowance, there's actually an entire video dedicated to how do you report that and what will the portal look like for you, since of course you don't have to enter subrecipient and subaward information. And then the third video that we think would be very, very helpful for folks is a walkthrough of how to designate user roles in the Treasury portal. We understand that there are people in new positions that are coming in, so you do have to change the authorized representative or other roles. So that video is very, very helpful as well. And then I don't know why the GFOA resources are not on this slide, but we will update the slide once we send it out, so they will be included on there. So NACo and GFOA, we both have our respective FAQs that we've used. We both have analysis of the Treasury's final rule. GFOA has created a really great resource as well, which is around their kind of recommended guiding principles for how you can actually invest those recovery funds. So we'll add those resources before we send out the slide as well too. And then finally, here is our contact information for folks to have. And again, you'll have this on the copy of the slides as well too. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Emily, I'll turn it back over to you. We have 2 minutes left to answer some questions, and of course, thank you to Emily.
Well, yeah, so we might have time for maybe one, maybe two questions, but the one thing I would say is your questions are not in vain, that we will be grabbing these questions and answering them to the best of our ability for you, where we can see aggregated questions, kind of asking, I see a lot of, me doing of the different questions. So I want to make sure that we answer those. So really appreciate that. Any questions pop out to you? I know we have a moderator who's kind of looking at the questions.
So Emily, it looks like that there have been a few around how, if folks are doing the standard allowance, how do they report that?
Yeah, I think that's, you and I can both talk about that. Maybe Erin, you want to go? Yep.
Yeah, I can start off. So for the revenue loss standard allowance, so when you actually are in the project and expenditures portal, you will still be, providing a project overview. So like the title of a project, you will charge it to EC 6.1 or 6.2, but 6.1 is government services. When you are and then if it's only government services, the fields for both the subrecipient and the subaward will actually be grayed out. You won't be able to fill in those sections. And then finally, as Emily mentioned, the recipient specific, that's when you make that $10 million standard allowance choice and you claim that. So you actually won't be able to fill out two sections or two or three sections of the report itself, because the project is just for EC 6.1. And then beyond that, kind of going, a little bit deeper in terms of reporting, how you're spending the money in government services. The reporting is a little bit more narrative in nature. Of course, you still have to keep all of your records for how you are using the funds, but there are kind of more, actual boxes for you to type out how you are investing the funds in government services.
And so there is a few questions about salaries, specifically how does uniform guidance apply to salaries? So I'll just mention this really quick, and then we might have to call it a day, but uniform guidance applies to all spending, period. You need to go and make sure that familiarize yourself with uniform guidance, but applying the SLFRF funds to salaries doesn't necessarily exempt you, or it isn't exempt from uniform guidance. It is just, it's a little bit lighter load because you are simply aggregating those expenditures for the salaries that are expended. And so that 6.1 category then becomes a category that you then will be uploading bulk information in. There is a great variety of questions, and I think maybe, Erin, we might be able to assess this and consider how we might be able to answer all of these questions, but really appreciate your attention today and look forward to following up with you on more information as you are preparing for your April 30th date. So back to you, Erin.
I think that's it. But again, if we didn't get to your questions, again, great questions, we're actually able to download the chat. And again, Emily and I will look through these and we can follow up. But again, just really appreciate, of course, Emily, for that amazing overview of every part of uniform guidance and much, much more. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your days and week.